want to work for any of these three people as your boss, hey? Who's got a question that they'd like to ask or a comment that they'd like to make? Please, up the back.
Sure.
Could you stand up, just give your name?
I can do that. My name's Martin Thomas. How do you do? Fascinating chat. You talked about pessimism and fear.
Yes.
Our current Prime Minister said, about a couple of months ago, we don't go to bed fearful enough. He's taking a leaf out of Donald's hymn book. So, and he's back with the media. So bad news sells. So it's kind of all pervasive for the majority of people that pessimism is something they just read about once upon a time, or that they live, and optimism is something they read about once upon a time. So it's really hard for a lot of people to actually kind of break through this sort of meniscus of fear, especially when you've got a government who's deliberately trying to promote it in order to make us, as the voters, rely on them a bit more. So it's kind of self-defeating. So my question, I guess, is, do we need systematic change, fundamental systematic change?
Who'd like to take that first, right?
I would definitely like to take that. I spend a fair bit of time, because of probably my role at EPA, talking to school students. Potentially quite a lot of BCE students. And I was out at a school in Melbourne's southeast. At the time, Extinction Rebellion before they were in front of Jeff Shedd, they were sitting in the streets. And the students asked me whether I was depressed about climate change. And I said, no, I'm not depressed about climate change. How do you feel? And they said, no, they were talking about Greta Thunberg, and they were saying, well, we really think that your generation has destroyed the future for us and our children. And so it's, these are mature young people who are really putting it out there. And that's clearly a feeling. And so I started talking about what they were doing. And I said, well, certainly you can be like Extinction Rebellion, you can, personal activism, there's a space for personal activism. But let's talk about what you're doing at home and what you're doing at school. And so when talking to them, and I asked how many of their homes had solar panels, it was about 80-odd%. When we talked about what's happening at the school, there was a group of them who'd been leading what they call the green team at school that they came up with and presented to the school. The school has now looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a result of that, and gone so far, not just recycling waste and things, as important as all of that is, but they're actually looking at their supply purchasing chain to make sure, looking at things like modern slavery. And so by the time we got through that conversation, and then we talked about, that was personal action and what they were going to do in the future. And so by the time we got through that conversation, we talked about how we can all make a change. And, the quote from Margaret Mead about never forgetting the power of one person to create change. And at the end of it, I got these wonderful emails from them saying how they felt empowered to make change, as opposed to feeling depressed about what we had done and what we have created. And I think they've got a reasonable argument, but nevertheless, I think the power to change is within each of us. And the more we do that, the more that each of us take action, not only the more optimistic do we feel, but the more optimistic those around us feel.
Please, sorry,
So I was just going to add a little bit to that, so apologies. Emotions like fear and rage and outrage, right? What you do with that, to me, is what's critical. It's okay to be scared that things aren't going, or scared by the challenges you face. It's okay to be outraged by an injustice that's happened. But an optimistic mindset will take you to the opportunities, will take you to what else have we achieved, what else can we do. A pessimistic mindset takes you to, this is hopeless and there is nothing I can do. So there's nothing wrong with being outraged.
Victor congratulations on putting together this forum. Charles Kiefel's my name. I am enormously optimistic about the future of Australia, the next 20 years. 3 points. First, Australia is going to produce a budget surplus for the first time in 10 years. We have a stable government of people of reasonableness and common sense doing good for the nation. Secondly, we have in Australia an abundance of resources. We have the largest coal, iron ore and precious metals in the world, the largest uranium mines, resources in the world, which I think that if we want to get rid of emissions, you go nuclear and build nuclear plants with safe safeguards. We also have a very good batsman, the best batsman in the world is Smith, back into the Australian cricket team, which I'm very optimistic about.
No, I'm not so.
Well, you may not have, I jolly well am. And I think if we think good and help others and make every person each day feel good about themselves, it's a gift not just for one person, for 2 people. But it's for myself and for the other person you make happy. Happiness is something we should pursue, and we are very lucky. We also, thirdly, have the 3rd largest fully funded superannuation system in the world. This is a major positive for savings and for the growth of our nation. We are a lucky country for our resources, for the quality of the people we have in Parliament, and also the people in professions, most of whom are doing a tremendous job. And I just want to say that I think we should just be grateful about what we've got.
Beautiful. And gratitude is one of the great underpinnings, isn't it? Sue next. Now Sue, just before I introduce you, so Sue and I did a half day with prison warders a week and a half ago. And what was interesting was we'd actually done it with prisoners first. And the warders had seen such a change in the prisoners from an optimistic change of language, they thought, can we have a bit of that too? So Sue is the queen of purposeful optimism. So you need to explain that first and then add a bit.
Thank you, Victor.
Please stand up, Sue.
Thank you. Well, firstly, purposeful optimism, we take some leave out of your book there, which is actually directed and guided by a strategy. It's underpinned by resources that you can equip people with so they can actually go out and create constructive, positive change. And I think that's what leads me to my comment and question, which is with the news cycle that we actually have, we've got a lot of challenges in relation to how the brain operates, with risk being its default setting. So it's the actual place when the grizzly bear comes, it's going to actually get scared. And so if we've got a mainstream media that's constantly promoting negativity and what we can't do, how do we actually, besides going around to schools, because all of this is really helping me bring it back to what I can do and what I can influence, how do we actually change the narrative of our country? How do we actually get good news stories out, like the examples you just shared with us? Because we need to give everyone, not just our young people, hope, but purposeful hope, practical hope. What can I do? It's that kind of stuff that we're looking for. And I think with our prison wardens that we worked with, when we looked at purposeful optimism, what was really delightful is that we had a number of them come up to us at morning tea time, so we started in the morning at 8:30. And one of them said to me, she goes, you know, I've never thought about the world in the way you've constructed it. And now I can see a whole new vista, and I can actually take positive action, and I feel less scared about actually being the best that I can be. And I think this is what we have to do, is come back to what can individuals do. They must be shown these stories and how they can engage, because no one likes not having agency. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I was just going to say, you're right, and I think one of the things that we need to work through as a society is the balance between healthy skepticism and cynicism. Because if you start sharing positive stories, for example, if a politician stands up and shares a positive story, people are just going to go, you're being a politician, you just want to tell good news stories to find your vote. People become cynical. So as a society, we become really cynical. We become very suspicious of everyone's intentions. We worry that people are just trying to dupe us. And so we kind of need to have that balance. On the one hand, we can't be a whole society that's gullible and just accept what everyone tells us. But on the other hand, I think we need to balance it by saying, how do we tell people that actually we're all human beings, we all start off with good intentions. No one's out to really scam another person up front. How do we kind of have that default position where we'll take you at face value? If you're being nice to me, let me be nice to you. Do you know what I mean? That is one thing at the society level that we kind of need to change. And I think it starts with individuals. It starts with us. And I think that will help to change the narrative in terms of the fear thing. So politicians, people in general will use fear to manipulate, because that's kind of like a fundamental, as you say, biological reaction. Because that kind of pushes people in there, and kind of like, people study this, right? Individuals might be hard to predict as a population. They're like electrons, right? Electrons go everywhere, right? We put heat here, they will go faster in one direction or the other. You can kind of manipulate. So that's what fear does. And so it's about then making people aware of that, because the majority of people just live their lives unconsciously without purpose. So this is why being deliberate, being purposeful in your living, having a direction, having a vision and a strategy helps. Otherwise, people just drift along. Media tells them to buy this, to buy it. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing with fear. So being conscious. But you got to balance this with cynicism. This is the tension, and I don't have a good answer. I'm just saying, when you teach people this, then you teach them to be skeptical and be a bit cynical. But then you don't want them to go too far as well. So it's that balance.
And coming back to purpose, there was a study out of Italy that said that the common factors for active people over 100 was optimism and purpose. Optimism. So if you're still working, still being active in the community over 100, optimism and purpose are the two keys. Alistair?
Alistair, working?
No. You'll have to speak loudly.
Do I just talk loudly?
Yes.
I was going to ask the question for the difference between serendipity and optimism, but I was distracted by Cheryl. And a very positive thing that she said, and it reminded me of the Environmental Protection Act in Victoria of 1971, which I studied in final year law school. And the Environmental Protection Act, which is looked after by the Environmental Protection Authority, did so much to clean up Victoria, to clean up the air, to clean up the water, the roads, the grounds. You could see the Grampians, you could see the hills, which you couldn't see from Richmond 50 years ago. And I think that when we talk about the next generation, let them understand some of the history and some of the fabulous things that people have done up until now.
Brilliant. And it is an amazing history. When I was a little kid, you couldn't see across the bay. As you say, you couldn't see the hills. The Yarra stank. What's the next 50 years of the EPA?
Look, I sometimes think we forget about the fact that clean drinking water, sanitation, and good air quality is the basis for all of our health. Without that, we suffer immensely. And it is true that the difference since the Act in 1970, EPA in 1971, we do have clean air. And because we have water authorities like Yarra Valley, Melbourne Water, City West and South East and the others, we can be assured that the water we drink out of our taps is safe to drink. And that the sanitation, so the water authorities were set up, Melbourne Water was established at the end of the 1890s as a result of 2 typhoid outbreaks in Melbourne. And so we are blessed with that, there is no question about that. So, but it is interesting that in the air quality standards globally are set for effectively the healthy population, not for the very young, the very old. These are set by the World Health Organization or the immune suppressed or ill. And what's really interesting in London now is the air quality is so poor, is that the very healthy are getting sick. So those people who are cycling and jogging are actually getting sicker because their intake of air. And so we've gone backwards. And my great fear, it's interesting because I think about air being effectively the invisible health basis. And that, to turn that around in London now is going to take decades. And I don't want us to be in that space. So, I feel very positive that, and very optimistic in fact, that the policymakers, effectively our governments, are listening. When we talk at EPA, and our chief environmental scientist is talking about what are the issues for 2050. And that is we've doubled population since 1970 when the Act was established, and we will double again at least by 2050. And the impact of everything we do, everybody in this room, the impact of every little thing we do, not so much the old smokestack industries anymore, contributes to pollution, diffuse pollution. So we really do, the Environment Protection Act a new act has been passed in the last 12 months. I'm very positive about the fact that we're moving towards what's called a general environment duty, but let's call it a preventative duty to prevent pollution, which will take us through to 2050.
Brilliant. Great question, great answer, please.
Thanks, Victor. Tim Piper from the Australian Industry Group, and I'm not surprised that you're heading up this. Victor, we've known each other for years and you've been an eternal optimist, so congratulations. I'd like to ask a question both of Donna and Cheryl in particular, if I can, maybe just a minute on it. It's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, but I think that you'll be able to give it to them. Why should we be optimistic about the waste industry? Cheryl, you know the waste industry very well, and I think there is great reason to be optimistic about waste. And why should we be optimistic about the water industry? Because equally, we've got trials and tribulations in both, but I think there are opportunities that are being created. So I'm very interested as to how you both feel in those areas.
I am.
And by the way, Cheryl, publicly, congratulations on the work that you've done with the EPA over the last 8 years. You've been a monument to women, a monument to what has happened in regulation. You've actually achieved some real changes at the EPA, and I think you're going out next year on a high. So congratulations.
I just want to make it to June 30, Tim, because with EPA you're always between a rock and a hard place. And if you read the newspapers, we never get it right. Of course, that's not true. I've never been more positive about the waste industry. Waste and water are my industries, and why am I more positive? Because it's taken this crisis to actually make change, sometimes to make major policy change. We all pay for curbside recycling, every single one of us, through our rates. And the price has been driven down, 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 and we've ended up in a crisis. I unashamedly say that EPA took action. We had a major fire at Cooloroo. I'm unashamed about the fact that we took action to protect the Victorian community by saying you can bring no more waste or recyclables into these factories. Stop. The risk is too great, you're not managing them. What that's done is create, I think, opportunity to, clearly we've got, now the federal government listening, talking about we are going to ban recyclables. Let's not call it recyclables, let's call it garbage. We're going to ban our garbage from being exported. If we can turn it into a product, we can export it. And that could be a raw product, like we can flake our PET and we can wash it, it's a raw product. I've never been more optimistic that waste, and does that bring huge opportunity for the industry, technology, opportunities for young engineers, and for social scientists as well. So I'm very optimistic.
In terms of the water industry, one of the examples that I mentioned earlier was the waste to energy plant. Now that's not strictly speaking just water, but looking at more broadly our impact and what we can do as an industry to tackle it and create a full circular economy. Those conversations are happening across not just the water industries in Victoria, but nationally and outside Australia as well. And sharing of ideas, there are so many opportunities, not just on how we can better use the water resources we have, but match up various resources as appropriate, so whether it's recycled, what you do with potable water versus what you do with recycled, what you do with stormwater and rainwater, how you can set up communities where the loop is closed on water. Those conversations are happening. And maybe this is the engineer in me, but it's not an unsolved problem.
Yeah, and the X prize, of course, was for getting water from air, wasn't it? Wow. Deborah.
Deborah Silfidis is my name. Social media is a big part of our lives and our children's lives. We all have mobile phones and tablets, and we use them for good and for communication and private and public business use. But if we look at the research that a break from Facebook helps you be healthier, how can we and the future generation be more optimistic to use social media to deal with the tall poppy syndrome, online bullying, and the comparative syndrome that many of us feel when we see perfectionist pictures on Instagram and Facebook?
I'd love to begin. I'm sure the others have something to focus. Go back to one of the questions asked earlier on what can we do? Don't underestimate the power of every single individual to behave in a particular way and take action, to have conversations like this, to take a stand and behave, so using the online forum as one example, on not promoting articles that are clearly just purely pessimistic and purely clickbait and that how horrible things are, not engaging in those. Even the simple act of not engaging in that can be powerful.
A lot of times it's the controversial posts that get interaction. It's the ones that are a bit pessimistic, and not the optimistic ones or the nice ones. If you put a nice post up, you're lucky to get any engagement at all. It's the tall poppy syndrome in our culture that is the opposite.
So I've got 3 daughters, and this is a real issue for my wife and I to kind of think about, because this issue, this phenomenon is actually not new, but it's because it's now part of we become cyborgs. This thing is linked to us so much and so instant that it is becoming a real issue. People are studying this. So one thing to say is those social media companies hire neuroscientists and psychologists to design the interface to be addictive. So the actual swiping, the liking, the way it's designed, it's on purpose to make sure that you have a dopamine release rush, and it's designed like that. And so now that people are caught onto it, I think there are 2 sides to this. First is the regulation of that, and that's happening now. The self-regulation that's happening already with the big techs. For example, Facebook and Instagram now trialing removing the like button. So they're trialing in Australia, they're trialing around the world. Because that's a huge thing, having people like your post is driving a lot of the behavior, unconscious and conscious. So they're testing that. They are now using machine learning and AI to detect people who are depressed and sending them help, for example, because there's a rise in youth who are sharing, emotional postings, and they have a role to play potentially in that. They're now cracking down on fake news and things. So some things are happening. And there's a debate around, can you regulate this anyway? Because they're bigger than countries. These things are multinational. They've got populations that are bigger than a lot of countries, right? So that's one thing. But then on the other side is then educating us, the population about the risks. Just like any other thing that we have to deal with in terms, such as alcohol and smoking or whatever else, gaming. Things have to be done in moderation. We need to learn that they can be addictive, and then you need to learn to moderate it. And even adults like us in the room, we need to learn, because we myself are quite hooked up to my machines, and so I think you're right. And then you raise the issue of content. What about all of the? I think it's that's always been the case. People always compare, but now it's just so easy, and now everything's so fake. So idealistic. I think it's about educating the next generation. To be honest, we think we're educating them, but they're educating us. Really, it's a whole different world now. Different generation. It's as much as we can to teach them.
And there's much to be positive about to their activism. And
That's right. There's a positive side to social media. I mean, change can now happen. Movements are being, governments can't stop it now.
Kids in Hong Kong at the moment are fighting for democracy. Last question. So I'm going to do one more question, if that's all right. Oh, sorry, hang on. Can we do more than the one? Can we do 3 quick questions? Is that all right that we can all answer? Is that you might have, please?
Roger, Cheryl mentioned 2 different things. One was the children she was addressing said your generation gave us climate change, and the question about the EPA Act might necessarily show what the old generation did in delivering clean air. So part of the problem is perception of what the reality is, and it seems to me the optimist is someone who says if there's a problem we can find a solution. Do you think, panel, that the younger generation, and I've got a granddaughter who's 13 who I think is optimistic, do you think young people are as optimistic as we would hope them to be?
I think we'll answer that, then we'll come to it. I think everyone can answer that quickly.
Just a very quick one. How do you know that you're an optimist?
We'll separate that. We'll keep that separate. Cheryl, what's your question?
Hi, Cheryl Macy. Just really quickly, there's been talk about fear today and the impact that has on optimism. So in your view, which has the better capacity, does optimism have the greatest capacity to overcome? Fear of failure or fear of success?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions.
Okay,
So who wants to take youth first?
I'll take one question. We'll all take one.
Let's please. Okay. We'll let the panel organise. They are such good people.
The question of fear of failure. I think what we've got to learn is that failure is not to be feared. That without failure we have no research and no outcomes. We actually have to learn to accept failure. I've been at EPA now for over 10 years, and I think one of the first messages I gave to my people who were afraid of failure was, you've been employed for your knowledge, your skills, your experience. You know far more about your job than I do. Have a go. And if you do that with that knowledge, experience and skills, and with the right attitude, you're most likely to get it right. But if you don't, I'm going to support you. I've got your back. So we have to learn to accept that failure is actually not to be feared, but is part of our lives.
I'd like to take one around the younger generation. So I've got 2 teenage boys, so 13 and 16. So the whole social media thing, the whole pessimism, struggling with the state of the world, all of that comes to bear. And for me, there's something around, firstly, our role as parents in that. But there was an interesting piece of research recently that measured, it was a question around, the question that students were asked all the way from grade 5 over a number of years, all the way through to year 12, right? Asked students whether they felt they could solve any problem that came their way. Not on their own, but with the people around them. So when you spoke to primary school age students, 70, 75, 80% of those children felt they could. Yeah, you know what, no matter what happens, yes, there are problems coming my way, but I reckon we can solve it. But by the time you got to year 11 and 12, they had fallen to below 40%, right? Interestingly, the schools that focused on the strengths of their students, their year 11 and 12 students are far more optimistic and far more hopeful about how they would tackle problems. So I think there's something around, yes, we all have problems in our life, but knowing that you have strengths around that, you can come up with a solution in that conversation, whether it's schools and parents, is quite good.
And Erwin, you're on, how do you know you're an optimist?
So the term optimism has the word optic in it. I think if you can see a better future and you can see an alternative that's better than what you have now, you're an optimist, right? And I think you can call yourself an optimist.
And the nice thing is that optimism actually doesn't peak. There's a very good study out of the US on the Latino population. It doesn't peak until you're in your late 50s or 60s.
It's true.
So you've got, because it's context.
Yeah.
You know that shit happens,
That's right.
but life goes on. And that's the key. I wonder if we can just, the 3 of you, just a last reflection. So starting with you, Erwin, we'll go reverse now.
Sure. I think to the comment about fear, I think, and I'm going to quote the Bible again, perfect love casts out fear. So fear is the opposite of love. And I think for me, using optimism means that you are showing someone a way forward and a positive way forward that is based on love, whereas fear actually divides. You create enemies, that's the definition of fear, and it's not a good way for a leader to lead. So I think lead with optimism.
Cheryl?
I'm also very optimistic about Australia and about where we live and how we live, and the fact that we're here today at the Australian Intercultural Society. So I'm a Jewish woman. Through the Intercultural Society, I've been invited to Ramadan. You know, I think that, you know, how we behave as Australians together, I'm incredibly optimistic about. And it's that human condition. You know, I go back to what I said to Victor in the first place. I think that we have a bias towards optimism. We just have to practice it.
Donna?
I'd just like to end on that I firmly believe that conscious and deliberate optimism is absolutely critical. Not blind optimism, not pretending everything's going to be awesome, but deliberate optimism, eyes wide open, embracing the knowledge in front of you, embracing the facts and the challenge, and stepping into action with determination and endurance is absolutely critical to all our success.
Well, join me in thanking the panel.